What I just demonstrated here is something we see in a lot of our classes. When we teach trigger control, our students learn that you should isolate your trigger finger and pull or squeeze that trigger straight to the rear. And that should help you land accurate and precise shots. However, many times we'll still see this, even though students understand what they're supposed to do. But there can be another reason why these shots are not going where they're supposed to go. And that could be because the trigger that you're using is really heavy. And that will force you to potentially move the gun right before that bullet leaves the barrel. And so if you're running into this issue or you have a pistol that has a heavy trigger, this video is for you. I'm going to cover a simple concept that you can use to keep your gun more steady so that you can land more accurate shots even if you have a heavy trigger. Before we get to the content, this video is brought to you by Dry Fire Mag. They're a great supporter of the channel, and if you don't know about Dry Fire Mag, it is a great tool that will allow you to use a striker fire gun just like the X macro that I have here, and you can take dry fire shots without having to rack the slide each and every time. All you do is you send your slide forward, you insert the dry fire mag, you'll have an audible click indicating when a shot has fired, as well as you also hear the reset as well. This is going to be great for those of you who are working on your trigger control, learning to shoot faster. You get a simulated feel which can be tuned to match your trigger's weight. They also have a smart dry fire mag version, which also emits a laser with every trigger squeeze. So make sure to check them out, the link below, if you're trying to improve your dry fire and take your shooting to the next level. Welcome back. I'm Myles at Tactical Hyve, and today I want to discuss how to deal with a heavy trigger on your pistol. And this is relevant for beginners and intermediate shooters, and maybe even some advanced shooters who really are dealing with a very heavy trigger who have not heard about this concept. As I discussed in the introduction, when we teach people how to manipulate their trigger, there are two principles that you want to keep in mind. You want to just isolate the trigger finger and move it straight to the rear. Now, it's much easier said than done. It's simple, but not necessarily easy. But if you follow these concepts, your dot or your sight, wherever it is before you break the shot, that's where it should remain. So the bullet, in theory, should hit exactly what you're aiming at. However, some people who are following those principles to the T, they're rehearsing it as they take a shot, they're doing everything slow, they still might have shots go down here. And it may not be because they're not adhering to the principles or at least even trying to accomplish them or implement them. It could be because they have a very heavy trigger or a trigger that's not ideal for their pull or something that they're not used to. They need to get used to the weight, so on and so forth. There's a lot of different reasons. But it comes down to not being able to keep the gun steady when they're squeezing the trigger. Let's pretend and exaggerate that this was a 100-pound trigger. So I have my barrel lined up with this black paster here, and this will show you that if I broke a shot right now and the barrel remains in this position, then theoretically my bullet should hit that actual black paster. So let me use this black paster and my barrel lined up with the paster to demonstrate or to describe what I'm talking about here. So if I understand trigger control principles and implement them correctly, my bullet will go directly here. But some people with a heavy trigger, they may be trying to implement those principles, but what happens is this. We're going to exaggerate here, pretend this is a 1,000-pound trigger, and they're trying to pull this trigger straight to the rear and just use their trigger finger, but it's so heavy that what happens is they have to use some of their fingers to help pull that trigger, let's say the three amigos here, or perhaps they're even driving down with their wrist. And when I do that, you see how the barrel moves. And that could potentially lead me to missing my shot. And it's not because, again, that I'm not adhering to the principles, it's just that the trigger is really, really heavy. So even though I'm trying to do it, I can't pull the trigger yet, I can't squeeze it, the gun's not going bang, so then I call in some other muscle groups, some other movements, and that makes the shot veer away from what I want to hit. Some people might think this is anticipation, and yes, it definitely could be, but in this particular situation, it is not. It's because I am trying to pull it so hard the barrel dips. So how do we overcome this? Right now, I'm using the SIG P365X macro. And the trigger on this gun isn't the most ideal. It's pretty heavy, and when you look at beginners or intermediate shooters using this gun, sometimes they can run into this problem where shots are going low because the trigger is heavy and it dips as they squeeze the trigger. So to compensate that, there's a concept that I want to bring up with you, and you can implement it. It's a concept, so you can apply the technique or experiment with techniques that will help you accomplish it here. So if we know that a heavy trigger might cause us to pull the trigger in a way that makes the gun or the barrel dip a little bit, we want to create some kind of solid base or shelf or floor so that it limits the amount that the gun will dip, or maybe even prevents it. What do I mean here? So let's pretend, take a look at my index finger here, my support hand. I'm going to put it low. It's not touching the trigger guard here. Okay, I'm going to rack the slide. So it's pretty low right here. I don't have a proper grip here on purpose. Okay, you'll see this right here. So again, there's no contact with the trigger guard. So let's say I have proper principles, I know how to squeeze the trigger, but it's heavy. So what happens is I call in some other muscle groups, or maybe my other fingers are doing some movement or adding some movement, which they're not supposed to, but I need to in order to squeeze this trigger because it's heavy. So what might happen is, notice the trigger guard now, this black part here, the trigger guard, it's going to dip. It's because there's no solid backing. There is no floor there that's preventing it. So what I could do is I could touch it here, all right? So now there's no gap. So the muzzle is not going to dip a lot. So this could improve it a little bit. However, this might not be enough too. If you have a very heavy trigger, so let's assume I have contact here, and again, pretending this is a very, very heavy trigger, like 1,000 pounds, whatever it is, of course I'm exaggerating here. So even if I had my support hand here, creating some kind of floor, and it's a really heavy trigger, I might have to drive really hard to bring that or to break that shot. So you saw the muzzle dip again. So the concept here is apply enough pressure to balance out that heavy trigger pull, right? So now instead of maybe just having contact here, maybe I have a little upward pressure, just a little bit. I'm not trying to balance out the actual dip in real time, meaning when I feel this dip, I'm not trying to push up. This is tension that is going to exist there from the very beginning, every time you establish your grip. So what this is going to do is, if I have more tension under the trigger guard and I squeeze this heavy trigger, now the barrel does not dip down. And you can experiment with that. How much pressure? It all depends on how heavy your trigger pull is, as well as your grip tension, your strength, the gun you're using. So there's a lot of different variables. But the concept here, again, is touching the trigger guard might not be enough. Okay, we obviously know we don't want our support hand to be down just like this, because now the gun will have a lot of room to dip. So if I were to do this, and this was just touching the trigger guard here, see how my barrel is lined up with the paster here, I might actually have to put more pressure so that the gun is upward like this, all right? And so now, in order to compensate for that upward pressure, I drive down with my right hand, and now it's stable. And so when I squeeze the trigger, again, it's not going to dip as much, or maybe I completely eliminate it. So let's demonstrate this live. I'm first going to put my support hand really low, and you'll notice I don't have contact with the trigger guard. I have a pretty heavy trigger here, and I'm just going to pull it straight to the rear. Let's look at the target here and see how my shots are going low. Because, as you can tell from the video, before I break the shot, the muzzle is dipping. Even though I understand the trigger control principles, I might be shooting a gun that requires me to engage other muscles, use other fingers to squeeze the trigger. Now, this second iteration, I'm going to touch the trigger guard, but I'm not applying any upward pressure or anything like that. I'm just touching the trigger guard, and now let's see what happens here. My shots are still relatively low because there's no pressure. There's nothing, there's no floor, or there's nothing preventing my muzzle from dipping or limiting that movement. The third iteration here, I'm going to implement that concept here. I'm going to apply pressure upwards on the trigger guard here. I have a heavy trigger, and now notice. You will see that the muzzle is not dipping anymore like it was previously, and it's because I've created that solid barrier. So if you are shooting a gun with a heavy trigger, try this concept out. It is not the only fix, but this is something that you can implement right away. And for a lot of students that we teach on the range, whenever they're having issues like this, adding that little pressure under the trigger guard can make a world of difference. If you shoot a gun with a lighter trigger, you don't have to worry about this. And it's one of the reasons why a lot of people do want a light, crisp trigger, so that the shooting is easier. But if you do have to deal with a 8, 9, 10, obviously I'm exaggerating, a very heavy trigger here, then try this concept out. I think it's going to really help. If you like the content, don't forget to leave us some comments, let us know your thoughts. Make sure to like the video and don't forget to subscribe. See you guys next time.